People in Atlanta still call Harlan Davis a butcher, the man who turned dark alleys into hunting ground back in 1982. Up in the Kentucky hills, old men use another story when his name comes up. They remember a thin teenager dragging two wounded buddies off a burning ridge, then heading back up for their rifles because you never leave a man's tools behind. Today's case comes from that split picture. Killer in the city, quiet saver in the mountains. Between those two faces, 12 dealers died in back lots and side streets, all tied to one stolen bag and one family secret recipe. You're watching a deep dive into what the papers named the Atlanta Alley Massacre. Here we walk through every step, from coal camp kitchens to blood on warehouse bricks, and ask what broke first, the man, the code, or the system around him. Before we start, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you want more hard, messy stories like this. Far from those Atlanta alleys, the story of Harlan Davis began in a narrow notch of land that locals simply called the Branch. The hills leaned close on both sides, thick with oak and pine, and a muddy creek traced the bottom. Old shotgun houses, most with tin roofs and leaning porch posts, clung to the road that wound along the water. Coal dust sat on windowsills, in kids' lungs, even in Sunday clothes hanging by the stove. Folks there said the land was rich and the people were poor, and that had been true for longer than anyone alive could remember. In that hollow, law rode in from the courthouse 2 towns over, but the rules that mattered were passed at kitchen tables. Kin looked after kin, even if they argued. A man who beat his wife might not see a deputy, yet he would likely find 3 cousins on his porch by dark, ready to settle things their way. What you owned for real was not the house, not the job at the tipple, but your name. People kept score on who paid debts, who told the truth, who gave help when food ran low. As a boy in the Branch, Harlan watched his father move through that small world like a man walking in church. The older Davis men knew how to turn corn, sugar, and creek water into clear fire that folks in 3 counties would trade near anything to taste. They said the recipe came from Harlan's great-grandfather, a thin man who had fought beside other mountain boys long before anyone there had heard of Vietnam. The paper it was written on stayed folded in a chipped green mason jar, wrapped in waxed cloth, kept behind flour sacks where only family hands reached. Eastern Kentucky in the 50s and 60s carried its own kind of squeeze. The mine cut shifts, then added them back, then shut down whole sections with no warning. Men lined up outside the office, caps in hand, waiting to read short lists tacked to a door. Some weeks there was pay, some weeks there was credit at the store, and some weeks there was nothing at all. When fathers had to borrow from neighbors just to buy coal for home stoves, shame sat in their chests like a stone. Boys like Harlan learned early that pride did not keep beans on the table. Outsiders who came through on road crews talked about Atlanta the way the old folks once spoke of Detroit. They said there were warehouses down there that never slept, trucking yards that always needed hands, and cash paid every week in real bills, not store credit. To a boy with worn boots and calloused fingers, those stories sounded like a kind of mercy. Yet the same men also came back with other tales, whispered on porches after children went to bed. Easy powder money, fast deals made in club lots, and city cops who cared more about keeping things quiet than keeping them clean. Harlan's first trip south came after a rockfall closed his section of the mine for good. He was barely out of his teens, old war training, when he climbed into the back of a pickup bound for Georgia. His mother packed biscuits, bacon, and the kind of silent blessing mountain women gave with their hands instead of speeches. His father did not hug him in front of neighbors. He only walked him behind the house and placed the mason jar in his palms for a moment. Felt the cool glass in his hands. He understood his father was handing him more than a jar. The old man closed Harlan's fingers around it, then took it back and slid it into the hiding place again. He said very little, only that a Davis man did not sell out his people, and that some things were worth more than wages or trucks or houses. By the time the pickup rolled out of the branch before dawn, those words rode with Harlan as heavy as any duffel. The hills folded away in the rear view, and the road opened toward Atlanta, a city he knew only from stories about noise, light, and steady pay. Years passed between that ride and the summer of 1982. Harlan worked in warehouses that smelled like dust and oil, stacking boxes under yellow lights. At first, he slept on a cot in a room shared with 3 other men from home. When that last thing was broken, it didn't happen with a gun or a shout. It started with a missing duffel and a lie that seemed small at first. Curtis Randall had always moved easy through rooms. He laughed loud, slapped backs, knew who liked cards and who liked pool. People in the neighborhood called him good people, the kind of man who could get you a job, a loan, or a line of credit if you stayed on his good side. Harlan let him handle the outside world while he stayed in kitchens and back rooms doing careful work with powder and scales. One hot week in early summer, a shipment came down larger than normal. The duffel held enough cocaine to float both men for months if they managed it right. Harlan cut his share slow, in their usual way, and sent it back out through Curtis. The rest rode in the trunk of Curtis's car, headed toward a small house where young dealers waited. That bag never reached the porch. Curtis came back tight-jawed, saying there had been a break-in, a quick snatch while he stepped away. In Harlan's world, losing a man's tools meant shame. Losing another man's product meant danger. The supplier up the line did not care about stories. He wanted his money. To patch the hole, Curtis made a choice alone. He took what was left of the cut product and pushed Harlan's mix farther than Harlan ever had, doubling the stretch. Then he did something worse in Harlan's eyes. He began to show younger men how to do it, passing the ratios off as his own smart idea, never saying whose jar the numbers had come from. A few weeks later, a warehouse buddy handed Harlan a small sample he'd picked up 2 streets over. The man said some kid named Reggie was selling Curtis's clean stuff now, claiming it went twice as far without burning noses. Harlan broke off a bit that night and tasted it the way old moonshiners once sipped their own run for proof. The cut sat on his tongue in a pattern he knew like a hymn. Same smoothness, same weight, same mix that had taken nights of slow work at his kitchen table to perfect. He didn't react at once. Instead, he bought from another corner through a different hand, then a third. Each time the product felt like his, yet none of those boys had ever stood in his kitchen or seen the mason jar. The truth settled in him the way coal dust once had in his lungs. Curtis had not just taken a share, he had taken the only thing Harlan truly called his and set it loose in other people's pockets. In the back room of a pool hall near the rail yard, Harlan watched Curtis hold court. Young men leaned in as Curtis talked with his hands, drawing invisible lines in the air. Harlan saw the way they nodded when he spoke about his mix, about making lean weight feel like full. Their faces showed the same kind of hungry hope he'd worn once, riding south out of the branch. Inside Harlan, hurt came first, then anger so cold it felt almost calm. His father's fingers on that jar, the warning about never selling out your own, came back as clear as the day he left home. In the branch, stealing a man's legacy counted as its own kind of killing. You took his name out of his children's mouths. Curtis had done that not by mistake, but by choice, spread it wide and tied it to a stolen bag. By the end of that week, Harlan was no longer asking whether something had been taken. He was asking who had learned from Curtis, how far the theft had spread, and what it would cost to pull every stolen piece of his recipe back out of the city. By the end of that week, questions filled Harlan's head the way coal dust once filled his lungs. He drove the same blocks again and again after shift, rolling slow past corners where Curtis's new boys worked. He did not blast the horn or step out to shout. He just watched who stood with them, who parked nearby, who slipped out of back doors carrying little folded bills. Each stoplight, each pass by a busy curb, added another name to the quiet list he kept in his mind. Some nights he bought small rocks through intermediaries, taking care never to show his own face. In the kitchen table, he shaved slivers off and tested them like a distiller tasting a batch. The pattern stayed the same. His mix, his measure, in hands that had never seen the mason jar tucked in his cupboard. The theft was no longer a guess. It was a fact as sharp as a cut finger. With that truth came another, heavier one. Curtis wasn't just passing his work. He was teaching it, spreading it like seed over city concrete. Harlan weighed his next move with the same slow care he used for every ratio. In one stack, he laid out options people in uniforms might mention. He could go to the police, say this man had taken something that belonged to him. Yet what would he show? A scrap of paper with numbers? No judge would listen to talk about mountain recipes for shine turned into a cocaine mix. To law, all of it was crime, no matter who wrote it down first. Another stack held more open violence. He could walk into that pool hall, put a gun in Curtis's face, and demand he call those young men off the recipe. That kind of move made quick sense to men raised where he was, but Harlan knew that it would not end with one threat. The boys would pick sides, shots would follow, maybe at his own door, maybe at Evelyn or the boys by mistake. A public war would eat the very thing he was trying to save. A different path began to form, thin at first, then clearer. In the branch, when someone broke the code, you did not always go at him head-on. Sometimes you stepped back and let him stand alone. Neighbors stopped lending, cousins stopped vouching. By the time trouble came, he had no one to call. Harlan realized he could try something like that here, in a city that still ran on quiet favors behind strip malls and bars. If he could turn off the taps around Curtis's side, rides, rooms, credit, the men using his mix would be left out on bare concrete. Behind a tired strip mall nightclub, in a gravel lot that stank of spilled beer, Harlan met an old mill hand who now worked the door there. Neon flickered above them. Passing cars sent waves of light and noise. The two men talked low by the dumpsters about work, about family, then about Curtis. Harlan said only that Curtis had crossed a line no mountain man should cross. He didn't ask the bouncer to lie or swing fists. He asked for smaller things. No more letting Curtis's boys slip in the back to hide when fights started. No more warning them when patrol cars rolled past. That same week, he sat on a tavern payphone, coins cooling in his palm, talking to a cousin who ran a place where Kentucky men gathered on the city edge. He told the first signs that Harlan's plan was working came in small ways, easy to miss if you were not watching. A driver who'd long done late runs for Curtis started turning off his porch light when the phone rang after dark. A bar owner who once kept beer cold for Curtis's boys began to say the taps were closed early, even when men could hear music inside. No one said there had been a meeting. No one named Harlan. They only said that some lines should not be crossed, and men who crossed them needed to stand on their own feet for a while. At a low brick ranch on the south side, Curtis thought the change was just a string of bad nights. He came home after midnight, shoulders tense, and tossed his keys on a Formica counter that still smelled like fried chicken. His wife slept in the back room, a fan turning slow above her. Toys lay in the hallway from a boy who had stayed up too late. Curtis opened the fridge, saw cheap beer and leftover beans, and told himself that a dry phone and cold bar rooms were just part of the trade. You had hot weeks, you had slow weeks. The next morning, 3 of his younger dealers sat at his kitchen table. They grumbled that the tavern would not carry their tabs, that a cousin with a big car no longer wanted to drive them to the far edge of town. Curtis slapped the table once, more tired than angry, and said they needed to man up and walk. In his head, the network he had built still felt strong. He trusted his charm. He believed that if trouble came, all those friendly faces in bars, clubs, and tiny stores would still answer his knock. Across town, Harlan listened. When the same cousin who had once moved boys for Curtis stopped by the tavern at the city edge, he told Harlan in a quiet voice that he was done hauling strangers who used a stolen recipe. The bar owner nodded and wiped down a glass, adding that he would serve men who came in peace, but not give cover to those who helped a thief. None of them said the word kill. They did not have to. In that small circle, everyone knew what it meant when a man lost his rides and his safe rooms. One of the 12 Harlan had marked, a thin dealer named Leon, felt the shift like cold rain on his neck. For months he had worked a busy corner with 2 friends and always had a ride home. That week, both friends claimed they were sick or broke or busy. The cousin with the car never showed. By Friday night, Leon stood alone under a weak streetlight behind a small grocery, pockets full of baggies cut with Harlan's mix, heart beating fast at each passing car. From a distance, Harlan watched the light flicker on Leon's face. He had followed the young man's steps for days, checked who came near his house, who shared his table. There were no small children nearby, no pregnant partner waiting on that porch. Leon was old enough to know the code, old enough to have said no when Curtis taught another man's secret without asking. In Harlan's mind, that made him fair game, even as a dull ache worked behind his ribs. When Leon stepped into the alley to urinate, away from the street's thin line of light, Harlan moved. The sound of the city was all around them, distant horns, a dog barking, a train grinding over steel. Up close, there was only the scrape of shoes on grit and the rush of a single short burst from Harlan's pistol. Leon crumpled beside a dented trash can, his breath leaving in a wet rattle that faded fast. By habit as much as intent, Harlan reached into his pocket and took out a small shard of green glass he had carried from the branch. It had once been part of a mason jar like the one that held his family recipe. He set the shard near Leon's hand, where the police would find it but not understand it, then stepped back into shadow and walked away down the far side of the block. At home later, Mick heard the front door open long past midnight and felt, more than saw, the change in the air around his father. Harlan's shoulders had a new set to them, heavy yet fixed. The first drops of blood had fallen. The plan to pull Curtis's world apart was no longer just lines in a notebook. It had soaked into real pavement, under real lights, in a city that would now start to take notice.
Mick lay awake long after Harlan came home. The duplex felt different, like the air was heavier. Streetlight glow leaked through thin curtains, spreading a pale square on the bedroom wall. In the front room, a chair creaked once, then went still. Mick did not see the pistol or the shard of green glass, but he sensed them anyway. Something in his father's slower step said that whatever had been planned in that notebook had finally crossed into the real world. By mid-morning the next day, word about the alley killing moved faster than any patrol car. A young dealer had been found alone behind a grocery, shot close and clean. Neighbors spoke on porches and in the corner store line, trading pieces of rumor. Some said the boy had been pushing Curtis's new mix. Others had he had started taking chances without backup. Folks agreed on one thing. When he died, no one was standing beside him. Curtis heard about it over black coffee at his own kitchen table. A runner came to the back door, eyes wide, voice low. Curtis listened, rubbing it a line between his brows. Dead sellers were part of the life. Funerals came regular as rent. What bothered him now were the gaps. Leon had been working a busy spot, yet his friends were suddenly sick or out of town. The driver who usually circled that block had parked his car at home. Even the tavern near the corner had locked its side door early. For the first time, Curtis felt his wide net of favors drawing back from him. That evening, a battered pickup rolled into the gravel lot of a country-style tavern on the city's south edge. Inside, wood paneling and neon signs framed a room full of Appalachian accents. Men who had traded coal dust for warehouse sweat, drank cheap beer and watched a ball game on a snowy screen. Behind the bar, a waitress moved slow between stools. At a side table, Harlan waited with 2 dented mugs of coffee, the smoke curling around his head like fog in a hollow. Roy Blevins limped in from the night air, shoulders hunched, ball cap pulled low. He'd hauled freight for years and powder for Curtis when money got tight. His knees ached, his lungs wheezed in cold weather, and a wife with bad lungs counted on every dollar he brought home. Yet even he had limits. Leon's death, the whisper that Curtis had stolen another man's work, and the sudden silence from other drivers all sat heavy in his chest. When he dropped into the chair across from Harlan, both men knew why they were meeting. They talked quietly while the jukebox played an old song. No threats passed between them, no raised voices. Harlan laid out the facts as he saw them. A code broken, a recipe taken, young men taught to profit from theft. Roy listened with his hands locked around the warm mug. In the end, he nodded once. He would keep hauling legal loads. He would not move product for Curtis again. That simple choice removed one of the most trusted wheels from Curtis's world. Across town, the cost of Harlan's first move showed up in softer form. In a cramped upstairs apartment, Leon's partner, Tasha, sat on a sagging mattress, staring at a shoebox of crumpled bills. Their little boy pushed a broken toy truck across the floor, making soft engine noises to fill the quiet. Rent was due soon. The stash Leon had promised would get them caught up, barely covered a week of groceries. No one from Curtis's crew knocked with help. Without Leon alive to earn, Leon's family slid into the edge of a drop they could not see the bottom of. News of Tasha's trouble reached Harlan 2 days later through the same cousin who brought word from the tavern. For a moment, he pictured the child on the floor, hand pushing that one-wheeled truck. His chest tightened, and he stepped out onto the small back stoop to breathe night air. The plan had always been about men who chose to learn his stolen mix, not about women and children. Yet hurt was pooling around those choices like water around a fallen stone. Harlan pressed the heel of his hand against his ribs and told himself the same thing his father had said years before. A man answers for what he takes. Leon had taken the recipe with both hands. Curtis had given, knowing better. The code didn't bend just because the price looked uglier up close. The list in his notebook still had names left.
That list in Harlan's notebook was not just ink. Each slim line held a man, a place, and the small crowd around him. When he turned the pages, it felt like turning soil over graves that had not been dug yet. He saw corners, back rooms, stairwells. He pictured hands passing little baggies shaped by his mix. For every name he tried to see the circle attached: brothers, lovers, children, elders who still prayed over meals. Some of those circles were tighter than he expected. A man he had marked as Terry Midtown turned out to live with his sister and her 2 young sons in a peeling blue duplex. Harlan watched from his car as one boy dragged a trash bag down the steps while Terry smoked on the stoop. The kid's shirt hung off one shoulder. No father stepped out. No second paycheck waited. That night, Harlan shut the notebook on Terry's name and left it closed. Later that week, he took Mick riding with him under the excuse of needing an extra set of eyes. They parked beneath a freight rail overpass, concrete pillars stained dark from years of rain and exhaust. Above them, trains groaned by with slow, grinding wheels. In the shadow under that bridge, Harlan pointed out 3 more men from his list as they moved through their night. One joked with friends, another hurried alone. The third argued with a woman on a balcony. Mick watched the men, but mostly he watched his father's face in the glow from passing headlights. A crease had settled between Harlan's brows that never fully left again. When the arguing couple came into better view, Mick saw the round curve under the woman's dress and the way she pressed her palm there like a shield. Years later, in a grand jury room with buzzing lights, Mick would remember that hand and admit that his stomach turned when Harlan's pen touched the notebook. He knew something important was being decided, even if no words were spoken. Harlan did not write a full name beside that man, only a short mark and a question. The woman's raised voice carried down, sharp even over the train noise, yet every time she snapped, her hand slid back to her belly. Harlan's jaw tightened. He turned the page and focused instead on another figure farther down the block, a cousin of Curtis's who lived alone over a shuttered shop. No children there, no old mother in a rocker, just a mattress, a hot plate, and greed. Over the next few nights, Harlan's route stretched wider than the overpass. He knocked on worn doors where women he trusted cooked beans and cornbread, women whose brothers or sons once worked beside him in the mine or the warehouse. In cramped kitchens that smelled of grease and soap, he spoke plain. Curtis had broken the code. Men running with him had taken what was not theirs. Harlan asked only this: if those men came fleeing later, do not let them sleep on your floor. He left each house quietly, carrying their silent promises like stones in his pockets. Some nodded, lips pressed thin, remembering cousins buried over smaller wrongs. One older neighbor warned that once such doors shut, blood usually followed. Mick, hearing pieces of these talks through thin walls and half-open windows, felt a chill he could not name. The network his father tended now seemed less like a safety net and more like a noose tightening around a whole stretch of streets, not just around the men whose names filled that small book.
Kitchen visits. The network around Curtis's men felt different. Harlan could sense it, the way a hunter reads still woods. Doors that once stood half open now shut fully at dusk. Men who used to linger outside bars walked straight home. Mothers who might once have taken in a cousin for a night now turned their radios up and left porch lights off. Mick saw the change and thought of a rope drawn tighter with every quiet talk his father had held. To keep the storm away from his own front step, Harlan moved his planning out of the duplex. One humid afternoon, he paid cash for a room at a roadside motel near the interstate. The building was a long strip of faded doors and buzzing lights. Trucks growled past all night on the highway, their lights sweeping the thin curtains. Inside that small room, Harlan cleared the bedspread and spread out a city map, his worn notebook, and a handful of pens. Lines began to cross the map. Each mark stood for a man from his list, a habit, a time when that man tended to be alone. One always walked home from a no-name bar after last call. Another cut through a back lot behind a pawn shop at the same hour every evening. A third sat in a stairwell to smoke when the club crowd got too loud. Harlan matched routes, counted blocks between them, and traced paths he could walk or drive in a few hours without crossing the same corner twice. Between planning sessions, he checked the strength of the web he had woven. A call from the motel payphone to the cousin at the tavern brought simple words. Curtis's boys had come asking for rides and been turned away. A short visit to Roy's small house on a dead-end street showed the driver at his kitchen table with freight schedules only, no side runs written in the margins.
An older woman from the branch who lived in Atlanta now promised, with a firm nod, that Evelyn and the boys could sleep there if things ever got too hot. Late one night, Harlan sat at the motel desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. The room smelled of old smoke and cheap cleaner. He wrote a short letter to Reverend Amos Whitaker back in Kentucky. The words were plain: a trade in the city, a partner who broke the code, a recipe passed down from men now in the ground. He did not describe the plan in detail, only said that if word came of his arrest or death, the pastor should remember that a man's name and craft had been taken before blood ever hit Atlanta pavement. He sealed the envelope, addressed it in careful script, and set it aside to mail on his way to work. He left a note at home, too, folded deep in the mason jar cabinet where only Evelyn might find it. In it, he thanked her for staying when the move south turned hard, asked her to lean on the few friends he trusted, and told her not to waste time defending his actions to strangers. If folks back home needed a story, he wanted them to hear it from Reverend Whitaker, not from city papers. Across town, Curtis paced inside his brick ranch, feeling the walls close in. Calls to drivers were unanswered. A visit to the country tavern ended with cold stares and short replies. At one house where he had once been able to sleep off long nights on a couch, the curtains twitched, but the door stayed locked. He told himself it was fear of police heat after Leon's death, yet some part of him knew something deeper had shifted. The easy goodwill he had always counted on had thinned. Near midnight, Harlan sat in his car a block away from a shuttered shop where one of Curtis's cousins rented a room upstairs. The street was almost empty, only a flicker from a broken sign and the far hum of traffic. The cousin stepped out at last, alone, pulling the door shut behind him. No car waited, no friend walked up. He checked his watch, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and started down the sidewalk towards a distant bus stop. In that moment, every quiet favor Harlan had called in settled into place. No ride swung by, no porch light blinked as a signal. The man walked under a weak street lamp, his shadow long on the cracked concrete. Harlan's fingers brushed the cool grip of the pistol beside him. The next steps would turn ink on paper into more bodies on real streets. By dawn, Atlanta would begin to learn that Leon's killing had not been a lone burst of violence, but the first drop in a hard rain that was now about to fall. The first shot of that long stretch came before midnight. The cousin never made it to the bus stop. Halfway there, he cut through a narrow side path beside a shuttered shop, brushing past a sagging fence. Harlan stepped from the dark like another shadow, close enough to smell sweat and cheap cologne. One short burst from the pistol ended it. The body dropped against crumbling brick. When the echo faded, only distant traffic and a loose sign tapping in the wind broke the quiet. Harlan left another shard of green glass by the still hand and walked away. A bakery worker found him at dawn while taking trash out to the alley. She stopped short when her foot slid, looked down, and saw the dark stain on cracked pavement. The man's eyes were open, cloudy, turned toward the rising light. Sirens came next, bouncing sound off tight walls. Patrol officers marked off the scene with tape that fluttered in the early breeze. One officer, tired and young, noticed he had seen something like this before. A lone cellar, close-range shot, no sign of a fight. By the end of that day, another body joined the list. This one lay behind a pawn shop near the tracks, face pressed into gravel, hands still half closed around air. He had been one of Curtis's favorite talkers, always ready with a joke. Now his mouth was packed with dirt. The same small glass shard glinted beside his arm. That night, a third man from Harlan's notebook was found slumped in a stairwell behind a club. The only sound there, the faint thump of music through concrete. Each scene had the feel of a door closing. No friends waited. No car idled nearby. At the city morgue, the chill never quite left the tile. Metal doors lined one wall like a row of shut mouths. Under bright lights, attendants rolled out gurneys and lifted white sheets. Detective Carla Hendricks stood near the end of the row, a legal pad in her hand, coffee gone cold on a steel tray. She had caught Leon's case days before. Now 2 more victims lay on carts beside him, each tagged with a number that meant less than their names on the street. Carla listened as the medical examiner spoke in plain terms. Same caliber, same tight grouping, same angle. All chest shots, close range, no struggle marks worth the name. She leaned in when the examiner held up a small plastic bag. Inside lay 3 bits of green glass gathered from 3 different scenes. On their own, they might mean nothing. Together, under that bright light, they suggested a hand that liked to sign its work with something only it understood. On a corkboard in the squad room, photos of the dead began to form a pattern. Leon from behind the grocery, the cousin from the shuttered shop, the talker from the pawn shop lot, the man from the stairwell. Lines drawn in red ink linked each one back to Curtis Randall's name. Another color line marked them as users and sellers of a new smooth mix other crews had started to envy. Carla traced those lines with the side of her thumb, thinking of the words she had heard twice now from bar owners with mountain accents. Code. Families passed through the morgue's small viewing room in slow waves. Tasha came first, shoulders squared, jaw tight. She did not cry until the sheep reached Leon's chin. A gray-haired woman pressed both palms to the glass when she saw her nephew on a gurney, lips moving in soundless prayer. Another woman, thin and pale, turned away before the attendant even touched the cloth, unable to look at the face she had kissed as a girl. The pain in that room was sharp and simple, needing no map, no board, no lines. Outside, on city sidewalks, talk ran faster than case files. Dealers spoke of a ghost from the mountains, a man who walked alone and left no witnesses. Older men shook their heads and said someone must have done something deep wrong to bring this kind of storm. Carla sat at her desk late, flipping through early reports, feeling the first hard edge of a pattern pressing against her thoughts. This was not random. Someone had decided who lived inside the circle and who died outside it, and that list, whatever it was not finished yet. Detective Carla Hendricks started turning that uneasy feeling into lines on a board. In the homicide squad room, under humming lights, she pinned up photos of the dead in a rough circle. Leon behind the grocery, the cousin from the shuttered shop, the talker from the pawn lot, the man from the club stairwell. Red string linked each face to addresses and phone numbers. Black marker added one more shared name at the center, Curtis Dean Randall. Next to Curtis, she taped smaller notes. Pool hall regular, loves to talk, new mix moving through his boys. Every file she opened on the victims circled back to him. They worked for him, bought from him, or at least used what people on the street called Curtis's clean cut. She wrote that phrase on the board and underlined it twice. Then she added another word she had heard in those mountain voices from the tavern and side streets, code. Carla pulled the first tape from the stack of interviews. The bar owner from the country-style tavern spoke in a slow drawl. He said the dead man had run with Curtis and played loose with another man's work. When she pressed for names, he gave as little as he could. He did not say Harlan's full name, only that quiet Davis fella from the warehouse, a man who kept to himself and didn't start nothing till something got stole. On paper, it sounded like half a riddle, but the tone in his voice made it clear he believed some invisible line had been crossed. Another tape held Roy Blevins, the limping driver. He sat near the recorder and cleared his throat before speaking. He admitted he had stopped doing side runs for Curtis right before the mess, said he was too old for boys who think the rules don't count. Carla asked what rules. Roy stared at the table, then talked about mountain ways, about how a man could drink,
fight, even hustle some, but he wasn't supposed to take another man's craft and pass it off as his. To folks like him, that kind of theft cut deeper than a fistfight. On her pad, Carla wrote, "Legacy theft equals motive?" It looked strange beside words like caliber and entry wound, yet as she flipped through more notes, the idea kept coming back. A clerk at a small store near the rail yard said Curtis had been bragging all spring about his new mix, how it stretched farther than anyone else's. A woman who lived above that store said she had heard older men mutter that Curtis was playing with fire he didn't build. No one would say whose fire it had been. It did not take long for another name to edge onto her board. In a thin file from a prior drug sweep she found it. Harlan Davis. Night shift warehouse worker, no felony record, once questioned and released after a small bust tied to Curtis. A line on the form read, "Possible cutter, keeps hands clean." That same name appeared in a payroll list from the warehouse and in a landlord's ledger for the duplex where Leon's young partner lived 2 streets over. In a city of thousands, their worlds folded close. Carla added Harlan's photo low on the corkboard, under Curtis's. Older, worn, eyes steady in the booking snapshot from the old sweep. She drew a thin pencil line between the 2 men. It felt like drawing a fuse between a match and a stick of dynamite. She didn't know yet which was which. Her partner, looking over her shoulder, muttered that it smelled like a crew war. Carla shook her head. Most crew wars left spray and pray shootings, wild scenes. This was different. Single shots, close range, no wild bullets in windows, no neighbors hit by mistake. In her written summary that week, Carla framed it this way. Someone close to Curtis, likely older and disciplined, had decided certain men needed to die. The reason was not territory alone or unpaid debt. It had to do with whatever sat behind that word code people kept using. The dead seemed to form a ring around Curtis, as if an invisible hand was stripping away his branches, one by one. When she closed the folder that night, Carla had 2 names circled in blue ink. Curtis Randall, talker, hub. Harlan Davis, quiet, shadow at the edge of every story. She didn't have proof yet. She did have a growing sense that the killer had not picked random dealers. Somebody had made a list long before the first body hit the alley, and that list, shaped by rules older than Atlanta's streets, was nearly complete.
Down in the brick church basement on the south side, folding chairs scraped over linoleum as people settled in for a weeknight meeting. The room smelled of coffee, floor cleaner, and damp coats. On the wall, a faded felt board still held crooked letters from Sunday school. Someone had written "prayer and support" on a sheet of paper and taped it to the door. That title covered more than the preacher's words. It covered fear, anger, and the sharp edge of gossip that had come since the alley killings began. Around the tables sat women in house shoes, men just off late shifts, and a few tired grandmothers who had lived long enough to see more than one kind of trouble roll through that part of Atlanta. Some knew the dead boys as kids who once ran in and out of their kitchens. Some had barely seen them except as shadows on corners. A few mountain transplants sat in a small knot, boots dusty from warehouse dust instead of mine rock, yet still carrying home in their speech. At the front, the pastor spoke first about sorrow. He named no killers, no crews, only the fact that several young men now lay in cold drawers, and that their mothers and children sat in dark rooms tonight. He asked the group to pray for peace. When he finished, the formal part fell away. People leaned together and began to trade their own thoughts in low tones broken by short bursts of feeling. One woman, whose nephew had run with Curtis, said the dead had chosen risk and now their families were paying. Her mouth tightened as she talked about rent due, babies needing shoes, cupboards that stood close to empty. She did not excuse the man who was hunting in alleys, but she also did not spare the ones who had pushed powder with easy talk of quick cash. In her eyes, the whole chain was rotten, from supplier down to the hand that took the money at the curb. Across the room, an older man from the branch shook his head and spoke about the word code. He told the circle that where he grew up, taking another man's hard-won craft and claiming it as your own counted as a deep wrong. People there treated that kind of theft like a quiet death. You did not do it and then expect neighbors to stand between you and what came next. His voice did not rise, yet his meaning lay heavy on the table in front of him. Some nodded, others frowned, torn between the weight of old rules and the sight of new graves. A younger mother from that same hollow, but now living 3 blocks away, said she was afraid. She had children who walked past the corners where bodies had fallen. She feared stray shots more than she feared broken codes. To her, the man with the pistol was the one bringing danger to her door, no matter what had started it. When she spoke, her hands trembled as they wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. Circling through those small pockets of talk, a visiting graduate student from a local college listened and scribbled in a notebook. She had come to study how tight communities handled crime and loss. What she heard that night confused the clean lines of good and bad she had learned in class. People in that room condemned the killing, yet still spoke about Curtis in hard terms. They said he had tempted boys with someone else's fire, that he had laughed too loud while using a name and recipe that were not his. They did not bless the shooter, but some said they could see how a man might snap if his last inheritance was stolen. The students' later field notes would mark one phrase again and again: stand alone. Many in that church basement felt the dead had been left bare when the storm came, because those boys had helped spread a theft that older folks could not forgive. Bar owners, drivers, and cousins had already stepped back. Now, even in mourning, neighbors spoke in ways that kept Harlan's family just outside the main line of blame. Evelyn's name came up only once in a soft promise from an aunt who said she would look out for that woman and her boys if it came to it. Out on the street afterward, people climbed the narrow steps back to the cool night. Porch lights flickered on up and down the block. Voices carried for a while, then slipped behind doors. Inside those houses, the story of the alley killings took on a local shape. Not just a crazed shooter, not just unlucky dealers, but a broken promise between 2 mountain men that had spilled over onto city pavement. That shape would not match the one written later in court records or big papers, yet it was the one that would guide who got help, who got shunned, and whose children found food left on back steps when times went lean.
While people left the church basement that night, Curtis walked streets that had once welcomed him, feeling each small refusal like another stitch pulling shut. Doors where he used to lean and laugh now stayed closed. Bartenders nodded without warmth, saying they were closing early, while music thumped behind them. A driver who owed him rides claimed his car was down, even though Curtis could see fresh polish shining on the hood in porch light. He tried to gather his younger dealers in the pool hall, but their jokes died fast, replaced by glances toward doors, alleys, and shadowed windows. Everyone in that room had heard about bodies in back lots, each one a man selling Curtis's mix, each one found alone without a friend. When Curtis promised protection and better days ahead, most mumbled agreement, then drifted out in 2s and 3s, leaving him staring at felt and balls. Alone in his car later, parked under a weak street lamp, he watched moths beat themselves against yellow glass and admitted his reach was shrinking fast. He pictured officers on his lawn, neighbors watching through curtains, his boy peeking between banister rails while strangers pressed him face down on the kitchen floor. Flight began to seem like the only choice left. If he could reach a cousin near Birmingham, maybe distance would cool whatever fire had started. He dialed that cousin from his kitchen, listening to the ring echo against faded cabinets, then sagged when the line clicked over to a buzz. The house felt hollow then, full of furniture, yet empty of shelter. Every tick of the clock reminding him how quickly goodwill could dry up.
Near midnight, he shoved clothes and cash into a duffel, stepped outside, and walked away from the ranch, leaving his car dark in the driveway. Streets slid past under his shoes, houses thinning out into small shuttered shops with bars on windows, every empty doorway reminding him how alone he stood. Near the rail yard, he slipped into an alley, planning cut-through toward a bus stop where he hoped vanish among strangers heading elsewhere. The alley smelled of garbage and wet brick. A loose bottle rolled under his shoe, clinking against concrete loud enough to make his heart hammer. From the deeper shadow near a loading dock, a figure stepped forward, not rushing, just there, like a decision that had ripened slowly over months. Later, photographs would show Curtis face down near the wall, one arm twisted, a small shard of green glass resting almost politely beside his still fingers. No one nearby called until morning. In that part of town, a single sharp pop in the dark rarely stirred more than a passing glance. While patrol cars rolled toward the alley, another set of doors opened across the district, this time at a police precinct on the south side. A middle-aged man in a worn work shirt walked inside, hands held away from his body, showing empty palms before anyone could shout or reach. Officers at the desk straightened, then eased when he stopped feet back, voice as he gave his name and said he was the one there. In the room, Carla Hendricks looked up from her board when the call came, heart kicking once as she heard the surname she circled in ink. Outside the precinct windows, the same city lights burned, but inside, the balance shifted. The hunter had stepped from alleys into fluorescent glare and custody. Behind him, the web of friends, cousins, and neighbors he had arranged would turn attention from helping his work to guarding the family he left. When Harlan walked into the county jail in cuffed wrists and torn work shirt, the quiet net he had woven around Curtis's men shifted to hold someone else. Cousins from the tavern, neighbors from the branch now living in Atlanta, even Roy with his bad knee, all turned their worry from back alleys to Evelyn and the boys. Groceries began to appear on the Davis porch. A landlord who had once eyed them hard at rent time granted a grace month without a word. No one bragged about helping. They simply acted, the way people did when a family name they respected was suddenly tied to a line of crimes they did not. Months later, the courthouse steps filled with cameras and bodies. Atlanta had given the case a name by then. Headlines called it the Atlanta Alley Massacre. 12 dealers dead in a tight span, one mountain man charged on every count. Inside, air vents hummed over worn benches and high, dark wood. Fluorescent light washed the color from faces as jurors filed into their box, eyes trained straight ahead, trying not to show what they had already read in the morning paper. At the front sat Harlan, thinner now, jail blues hanging loose on his frame. His hair had grayed faster since the day he walked into the precinct. Shoulders stooped a little, yet his gaze stayed level. Beside him, a public defender paged through thick folders, lips moving in a soft rehearsal of questions. Across the aisle, the district attorney laid out exhibits in neat rows: crime scene photos, ballistics reports, maps, and a small evidence bag holding 3 green glass shards. Detective Carla Hendricks took the stand early. She spoke in careful, steady tones. She walked the jury through the pattern. 12 victims, all tied to Curtis Randall's crew. Same caliber, same tight, close shots, no signs of wild fire. She pointed at a large board where red circles marked each scene, and all lines ran back to Curtis, and, just behind him, Harlan's name. When asked for motive, she did not mention the word recipe at once. Instead, she said every witness had used the same strange phrase about a broken code. Witnesses followed in slow succession. The tavern owner in his clean shirt, hands locked on the rail, told the court how Curtis had bragged about his new mix, while older men muttered that he was taking credit for work not his. Roy limped to the stand,
hat in hand, and admitted that he had stopped driving for Curtis because he did not want to stand between a man and the price for something he stole. He did not say who had told him that theft had occurred. He did not need to. The story lived between his words. A cousin from the branch, now living on the city's edge, testified that Harlan had come to him weeks before the first body fell, speaking low about betrayal and asking only that no more young men be sent to Curtis for work. In cross-examination, the prosecutor pushed him to admit he knew Harlan planned murder. The cousin met her eyes and said he understood there would be trouble, but he had not known the form. In his world, men who broke deep rules met hard ends. How that shook out belonged to God and the ones involved. Then came Mick. Older now than when he rode under the overpass with his father, he still carried the thin, watchful look of a boy who had seen too much, too early. He described late nights, the small notebook, the motel stays, the way his father had tested street product without speaking. He said, in a voice that cracked once, that his father believed the law did not care about stolen heritage, only about drugs in bags. When the defense asked if Harlan ever spoke of killing mothers or children, Mick said no. His father had skipped some names when he saw little ones on porches or round bellies on balconies. That detail did not excuse the dead, yet it painted a picture more precise than wild rage. At last, Harlan took the stand. He did not try to deny any shot. He said where he had stood, how he had walked, why he had left each shard of green glass. He spoke of the hills, the mason jar, the words his own father had pressed into him. He explained slowly that in his mind, the only things he owned were that folded page and his name, and that when Curtis took both, sold them, laughed over them in bars, it felt like having his grave dug while he was still breathing. His lawyer had begged him to lean on talk of trauma and fear. Harlan refused. He said he knew what he had done, knew what the law called it, and that he walked into the precinct because he was not running from either name. The prosecutor framed him as cold, methodical, a man who had turned grudges into a checklist. She held up photos of each victim and asked if a recipe was worth these faces. Harlan did not answer with yes or no. He only said that in the world he came from, some lines, once crossed, did not leave many choices that felt like living. When the jury filed out, the room held a long, thin silence. Hours later they returned. The foreman, sweating under the lights, read word after word, guilty on each count of murder. In the penalty phase, arguments over death versus life gripped the room. The state pushed for the chair, pointing at the count of bodies. The defense pulled on culture, on Harlan's surrender, on the fact that every dead man had stepped into a trade built on risk from the start. In the end, the judge spoke for the court and the state. He sentenced Harlan to 12 life terms without parole, stacked so no calendar could ever hold them all. He noted the killings were grave, that nothing in mountain honor or city law washed that clean, yet he declined the death penalty. Some in the gallery whispered that it was because of Harlan's war record, others because of his calm confession. Those closer to the back rows, where mountain voices sat, believed another reason hung in the air. Even in that bright, formal room, the quiet web of testimony had made it plain that this horror had not sprung from nowhere. It had grown from a theft that no one outside their world would ever quite understand.
Deputies led Harlan out of the courtroom in chains, the clink of metal chasing him down the back hall. Behind the swinging door, Evelyn sat on a bench with Mick and Jesse on each side, staring at the empty space where he had stood. A few hours earlier, a judge had given him 12 life sentences, stacked so no calendar could hold them. Now the building swallowed him, and the family walked out to bright steps and reporters with microphones, feeling smaller than they ever had.
2 days later, before sunrise, a prison bus carried Harlan south. He sat on a steel bench, wrists locked to a belt, watching fields and small towns slide by, thinking how far the road had taken him from the branch and from that chipped green mason jar. Intake cut his world down to numbers and concrete. Guards shaved his hair close, took prints, issued a thin mattress and a coarse blue uniform. His cell was a narrow box with a steel bunk, a toilet, and a slit of cloudy window. Days quickly fell into rhythm. Count, chow, laundry shift, count again. He folded sheets in clouds of steam, hands moving by habit from years in warehouses and barracks. Younger men with bright eyes and quick tempers watched him, curious about the quiet mountain killer they had heard about on the tier. Some tried to draw him into yard crews for protection. Harlan turned them down with a single shake of his head. Older inmates from coal states gave him space, sensing both the weight he carried and the line he had crossed. On visiting days, noise replaced the usual echo. Families filled a bright room lined with plastic chairs and vending machines. Evelyn came when she could, dress already going thin at the seams, a bus ride and a walk behind her. Mick sat stiff beside her, taller now, jaw tight. Jesse visited less often, choosing distance over the sight of his father in blue. They talked across a scarred table about rent, Mick's part-time work at a tavern owned by an old friend of Harlan's, and Jesse's plan to seek roofing jobs up north. One afternoon, Evelyn slid a folded note to him. Inside was a letter from Reverend Amos Whitaker saying he had taken the old recipe page from its jar, burned it to ash in a coffee can, and buried the mix of soot and soil near the Davis family graves. The news hit Harlan with two feelings at once. Part of him felt lighter, knowing no one could ever again pull that folded page from a shelf and sell it on a street corner. Another part felt hollow, knowing he had spent almost everything in his life to guard a secret that now existed only as a story in a pastor's memory. From that day on, he stopped talking about the hills during visits and asked instead about small, ordinary things, report cards, leaky pipes, the taste of Evelyn's Sunday beans. Outside the walls, his old network bent itself toward the family he had left. Cousins made sure groceries found their way to the duplex in rough months. The tavern owner kept Mick on even when business dipped. A relative in Ohio called with news of steady roofing work for Jesse, far from Atlanta corners. Years later, Harlan died in the prison infirmary, a passing marked only by a note from the chaplain. No cameras came. His body went to red clay, his recipe to ash, and his name to stories traded softly in bars, kitchens, and small mountain churches.
Years after Harlan died in the prison infirmary, the story of the Atlanta Alley Massacre still surfaced now and then. Editors liked the sharp title and the count of dead men. Young reporters, who had not been alive in '82, were told to see what became of the families. One spring, a feature ran that did just that. The writer never met Harlan. Instead, she sat in small front rooms and back booths, notebook open, as people who had lived through the blood spoke in softer voices about what it left behind. On the west side, Tasha sat on her worn couch while her son Marcus leaned in the doorway. She had been Leon's partner when he was shot behind the grocery. Back then, she had a baby, a shut-off notice, and no one bringing money through the door. Now, Marcus stacked freight at a warehouse, shoulders broader than his father's, name clean on pay stubs. Children at school once called him that dealer's boy. Church ladies slipped extra food to his mother. Marcus grew up knowing his father had sold powder that carried another man's work and died alone for it. When the reporter asked what she felt toward Harlan, Tasha said she hated him for the gun and hated Curtis for putting Leon out there with a stolen recipe in his hands. Across town, in the tavern where so many mountain men met, Mick Davis wiped the bar and watched folks watch him. Some knew who he was before he spoke. Others learned when a friend leaned close and whispered, and then their eyes flicked toward him and away. A few asked, careful, if the stories were true. Mick always said the same thing. His father had killed 12 dealers and had walked into a precinct when it was done. His father's partner had taken the Davis mix, taught it wide, and laughed. Both men had broken something large. After closing, in the dim light, Mick sometimes sat on a stool and wondered which break had hurt more people, the theft that sparked the first shot or the shots that followed. Jesse chose distance. He had left Atlanta for a lake town up north and worked roofs year-round. On job sites, he used his middle name and last. At home, his children knew they had a grandfather who never came back from prison and cousins in the hills they had not met. On quiet nights, he told them about a narrow hollow, a small church, and a graveyard where their blood started. He waited longer before telling them about the alleys. When he did, he said their grandfather had believed that if he did nothing, the last thing his people truly owned would be lost. Then he told them that some losses had to be borne, because the cost of stopping them could wreck even more. Among the families of the dead, feelings never settled into one shape. Some pushed the past down and would not read any article with Harlan's name. Some clung to anger, certain that no talk of codes or recipes could explain lining men up in back lots and leaving them under trash lights. A few, like Tasha, sat in the middle. They believed the dealers had stepped toward risk on their own feet, yet they also believed no one had really shown those boys another way to climb out. One hard fact did tie many of their stories together. No new wave of blood came for the Davis family. No cousin of Curtis raised a crew to burn their porch or beat their sons. Doors did not splinter at night with revenge. The same web Harlan had once tugged to leave Curtis standing alone, now bent to keep Evelyn and the boys clear of payback. Whether that felt like justice, luck, or one more wrong turn depended on who was speaking, how close they had stood to the bodies, and what they had lost when the alleys ran red.
10 years after the trial, the neighborhood where most of the killings took place did not look the same. The old brick mill that once cast a shadow over those alleys now had bright glass doors and a new name in shiny metal on the front. City planners called it a live-work loft project. Men in hard hats had knocked out broken windows, scrubbed soot from walls, and turned loading bays into parking decks. Where Harlan once waited in the dark, young couples now walked small dogs under clean street lamps. At a public hearing in a glass-walled room at City Hall, maps lay across long tables. One map showed the South Side in 1982, shaded blocks marked Industrial and Blight. Another showed the same grid years later, colored in with Arts District and Mixed Use. A planner with rolled-up sleeves talked about revitalization and new tax bases. He did not say the words Alley Massacre. Most people in the room had moved in after the blood dried. They knew the story, if at all, as a short line in a real estate blog about a gritty past. None of those bright maps showed the people who had lived there before. By the time the lofts opened, most of the old renters were gone. Rising prices, new leases, and no loitering signs had pushed them out along bus lines and into cheaper strips farther south and west. Tasha ended up 3 miles away in another worn complex. The tavern where mountain men once gathered closed when the owner retired. The building later held a yoga studio, then a coffee shop. Mick poured drinks now under a different neon sign, but older customers sometimes still called the bar the Mountain Joint out of habit. The drug trade did not vanish. It shifted, the way water finds new cracks. Cocaine faded as the main draw. Crack hit hard in the late 80s, then pills, then meth. Corners moved a few blocks over, closer to bus stops and dimmer lots. Younger dealers there did not know the names of Leon, the cousin, or the talker from the pawn lot. If they had heard of Harlan at all, it was as a rough legend, some old head from the hills who lost it over a bag long before they were born. The careful mix he had guarded was gone. Faster, harsher cuts took its place. Inside police buildings, the case lived longer. At the academy, cadets watched a faded slideshow while an instructor walked them through it. The file was used to teach pattern work and how culture could shape motive. A younger Carla Hendricks appeared in some of the photos, hair darker, shoulders straighter. Now, with gray at her temples, she stood at the front of the room and told recruits that not every killing grew from simple greed. Some grew from what people felt had been stolen long before money changed hands. She warned them that if they ignored that part, they would miss why certain men moved the way they did. Academy handouts listed lessons learned. Watch for clusters around one hub. Take local talk of rules and codes seriously. Do not write off older, quiet suspects just because the street faces are young. The pages did not speak Harlan's name often, but his path through alleys and courts sat between their lines. Fresh officers carried that file in their heads as they walked new beats, though most never knew how the Davis boys were getting on, or how many of Curtis's kin had drifted to other cities and other hustles. Back in eastern Kentucky, the branch changed too. The mine never reopened. Trailers and empty lots took the place of some old houses. Younger people left for Lexington, for Ohio, for anywhere with work. Pills came in through crooked clinics and back roads, quiet and fast, leaving nodding heads on porches where men once talked about square coal and clean shine. In churchyards, graves from those slow overdoses began to outnumber the stones from mining falls and car wrecks. Reverend Amos Whitaker walked more slowly now between them, leaning on a cane. Near one unmarked patch of ground, he paused sometimes and thought of the day he burned a folded page over a coffee can. Children in that hollow heard the Atlantis story in broken bits. Some said that a Davis man had gone crazy and shot a dozen strangers. Others whispered that he had taken mountain justice too far when a partner tried to steal what his people had left. Older folks shook their heads at both versions. Around kitchen tables, they tried to explain that two wrong roads met in the same dark place. A theft that cut into a man's name and a string of choices that turned that pain into bodies. Looking at the south side from a distance, it was easy to say the place had healed. The alleys were lit. The mill had art in its windows. Crime maps showed fewer dots there than in other spots. But beneath those clean lines sat other truths. The families pushed out still carried scars. The hollow still carried grief. The systems that had allowed both the theft and the blood, the thin jobs, the quiet lookaways, the honor held higher than life, had bent some and shifted, yet they had never fully broken.
In a warm lecture hall on a fall afternoon, 50 students watched as a projector threw crime scene photos onto a screen. The case name on the slide read State v. Harlan J. Davis, but most of them knew it by the shorter title they had seen, The Atlanta Alley Massacre. Their professor, a gray-haired woman who had once worn a badge, let the images sit for a moment. Taped-off alleys, chalk outlines, a lonely stairwell behind a club. Then she clicked to the next page, where words replaced pictures. Motive, code, legacy, system failure. Long summaries in textbooks liked clean shapes. They said a resentful drug worker felt cheated, hunted 12 dealers, and went to prison for life. That line fit in a margin beside a chart about crime. It was easy to teach and easy to forget. Yet every time this case came up, older officers and mountain transplants in the room shifted in their seats. They knew it had not been simple rage or simple greed. It had been something twisted from love and anger, stretched across years of hard work and quiet pride. Far from that campus, people who once lived near the alleys argued over words like justice and revenge. By law, what Harlan did was murder, stacked 12 times over. No rule from any hollow could turn those dead men back into sons and fathers. In the world he came from, Curtis's theft looked like another kind of killing. When Curtis took the Davis necks, spread it, and laughed, he cut into a man's sense of self deep enough that legal language had no name for it. Harlan answered through a different court,
the network of drivers, cousins, and bar owners who stepped away from Curtis until he stood alone. Years after the shots stopped, that network remained the strangest part of the story. It had cushioned Harlan's family when the law came down. It had left Curtis's boys without rides, without shelter, without anyone willing to stand in front of a bullet for them. In class, the professor called it informal power. Outside class, some would have called it mountain justice, others quiet cruelty. Was it fair that one man's social capital could decide who got help and who did not when danger walked the block? Legacy also sat heavy in this case. Harlan went to war, broke his body in mines and warehouses, and watched jobs vanish. All that time, one thing stayed constant: a recipe and a name, both handed to him with few words and weight. When he died in prison, that paper was ash in Kentucky dirt, and his sons carried a story stained by blood. The men he killed had legacies too, though none as neatly written. Children like Marcus grew up with holes where fathers should have stood, learning to work honest in neighborhoods that made the quick way look tempting. Years of distance make it tempting to sort everyone into clear piles: monster, victim, hero, fool. The truth this story pulls forward is rougher. A partner broke a trust that the law did not recognize. A father chose to defend that trust with a tool that could never mend it. A community, squeezed by poverty and ignored by bigger systems, fell back on unwritten rules, then watched families crack under the results. You can call what happened in those alleys justice, revenge, madness, or some bent mix of all three. Whatever name you choose, bodies remain, the hollow still struggles, and the South Side carries a story that new paint and bright lights have not washed away.
On a bright afternoon in the present day, the old alley behind the textile mill does not look like a place where men died. The brick walls are sandblasted clean, string lights hang over a landscaped courtyard with benches and a few metal tables. Where patrol cars once idled, someone has planted ornamental grasses in neat lines. Dog walkers pass through, earbuds in, coffee cups in hand, never glancing up at the high windows that used to be broken out and black. On one wall, half hidden behind a row of bike racks, a mural runs along the brick. It is small compared to the newer art around the city. No artist tag, no bright sponsor logo, just a painted outline of an alley under a dark sky, a suggestion of a man's shadow, and a scatter of green shards near the bottom edge that catch the light. A date sits in one corner, 1982. Most residents in the lofts above think of it as that old crime painting. Few could name the case if you asked. Fewer still could tell you about a Davis or a Randall. If you stand there long enough, though, people find you who remember. An older maintenance man might mention hearing his own father talk about the week 12 dealers dropped in backlots, all tied to one stolen bag and a betrayed code. A middle-aged woman walking a dog might say her cousin used to live over here before it got fancy, and that he still flinches at the sound of a car backfiring. Once in a while, an ex-officer will pause by the mural, hands in pockets, and look at the painted glass with a tight jaw, thinking of old case files and interviews in hot rooms. Far north, Jesse works another roof, hammer rising and falling against blue sky. Nearer by, Mick wipes down a bar in yet another low-lit place, wiping the same circles as his father once did hers, but pouring legal drinks instead of cutting powder. Marcus finishes a late shift at the warehouse, clocking out with sore shoulders and a steady paycheck. In eastern Kentucky, the branch grows quieter each year. New graves appear, old porches sag, and stories about Harlan get shorter as the people who knew him age out. Some call him a man who lost his mind over dope. Others still say he went too far trying to hold on to what was his. For most of the world, the Atlanta Alley Massacre is now just a case study on a screen, a line in a textbook, or a half-remembered headline. For the few families who lived under its shadow, it never really ended. They carried different pieces of it,
The sound of a knock that came too late, the sight of a father in a prison jumpsuit, the feel of a folded recipe turned to ash. The city moved on, built lofts, painted murals, and shifted the trade a few blocks over. The hollow in Kentucky kept burying its dead and arguing quietly about what counts as honor when the jobs are gone and the rules don't match the law. So when we talk about this case now, about a quiet man who hunted 12 dealers to defend a legacy the courts didn't recognize, we're really circling a bigger question. What do you owe to your name, your people, your craft, when the systems around you don't seem to care if those things are stolen? And if you decide to take justice into your own hands, how far can you go before justice turns into something else entirely? That's where I'll leave this one, standing in a courtyard that used to be an alley, looking at green glass painted on clean brick. Was Harlan Davis a monster, a broken man pushed past his limits, or both at once? Was Curtis Randall just a hustler trying to feed his own, or the first thief in a chain that wrecked a dozen lives? Tell me what you think in the comments. Was this justice, revenge, or neither? And if you want more deep, hard stories like this one, where the answers aren't simple, hit subscribe and stay with us for the next case.